Nick. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. The most recent version of MIS Quarterly came out. At this point, it's over a month ago.
Yeah.
But there's something that came out in that it was an editorial, and it was an editorial on causality. And one of my favorite lines in this editorial is at the beginning. After all, this is MIS Quarterly, not Causality Quarterly. In the intro of this editorial, which I thought was really fun because, as we've talked about the past in this podcast, I think that, if the first chunk of IS research was TAM and kind of psychometric survey based, then the second, like IS research 2.0, I would argue is econometrics, right? People discovered a whole bunch of big data and they have their one hammer, and that's econometrics. That's the one way we're allowed to analyze big data. And then this editorial, I think, is one of the steps this year that is leading to kind of IS Research 3.0, which is we're not going to just have the single narrow defined view of causality that econometrics has for our field, right? Not that that's bad, but it's not the only thing in our
Nick,
repertoire.
as usual, you missed out the most important part of that paper. The most important part of that paper title, in fact, it doesn't just say causality; it's causality and diversity in IS research, right?
I don't
So
know what
it's
that means.
actually it presenting us with different views of causality, which is why I was really excited when I saw it, and I was looking forward to this episode because we got everyone of that author team here with us today. We are 6 people here for the first time. So we got Nina, Ling, Sunil, and Andrew himself.
Hello.
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 Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for making yourself available. So we got 6 people from 3 different time zones. We should say that as well. Like for me, it's perfect midday. For our friends from North America, it's early morning, and Andrew, it must be. What is it actually? Is it midnight? It must be midnight for you.
An hour to go.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Well, thanks for making yourself available. We were really looking forward to this particular episode, and I was being asked a couple of times before. I was being asked, Jan, so you and Nick, do you script your podcasts? I was like, no, what? No, most of the time we don't even prepare. But this time, I don't know about you, Nick, but I prepared. I mean, I read a whole bunch of papers on causality, and I'm really excited to have this discussion today.
Good. Well, I'm glad you read something. That's the first time. That's the first time you actually admit to reading something.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, no, this is beautiful. So let's start, right? And I think that, I had my idea, Wrecker, and I wonder how you would respond to it as the authors. That's how I see this. It's like, thank goodness, I think our view of or our econometric view of causation is exogenous, unidirectional, when we can instrument something, and it lends us to doing, I guess, streetlight effect sort of research, right? Where only data sets that fit the strict requirements of econometrics really count, right? That we can only publish those. But I feel like, your research gives us, or your article gives us kind of a broader view. I mean, how would you respond to that? Am I misreading it? Am I just projecting my view of things onto the world, or what's going on here?
If I can start it off, and I think I'm happy if my co-authors can join me later. So I think the way we think about this is this article is, let's say, it provides a pluralistic perspective on causation, and basically a sobering view of causality. Like, so as you pointed out, Nick, that sometimes, let's say, we believe that it is perfectly legitimate for some people to pursue causality and maybe look for data sets where, let's say, they are interested in a particular causal question, and some data sets or some natural experiments enable them to estimate those kinds of effects. But that is not the only kind of research that will be going into MIS Quarterly. MIS Quarterly is very, very open to different kinds of research. Sometimes the research can be very descriptive. Sometimes the research can use a different viewpoint related to causality. It might be a path analytic view of causality, which uses very different notion of causality compared to the potential outcomes view of causality, which has become quite dominant in the last 20 to 30 years. And then there is also the third viewpoint of causality, which is the configurational view of causality. So we just put these things together to basically give a sense that, we are open for business, and researchers should be open to pursuing multiple ways of thinking about causality in a programmatic agenda for research.
So Sunil, what's the backstory here? I mean, one of the backstories could be that, look, IS is a pluralistic field. We have to entertain a diversity of viewpoints on certain aspects, such as causality. A second backstory might be that you've had a trouble in being an editor or reviewer for certain types of paper that were pushing one view, and they always receive pushback from reviewers, espousing a different view. Or was there a third, maybe a backstory that I don't quite foresee? What made you, work on this editorial?
I think Andrew can speak to that. Andrew and I had some conversations on that.
Yeah, look, it's an excellent question, Jan. And I think there were several motivations, and probably just like in any paper, as we worked further on the editorial, it helped us crystallize what those motivations were. But there were sort of the initial sparking motivations. And one of them, to be honest, for me, was sitting in a doctoral consortium and looking at the papers that were being presented. And these are like some of the brightest young minds coming into the field. And it looked like they were just designing studies to pass all the tests for causality. And that's the wrong way of going about research, right? And these are like incredibly bright people. Yeah. And why are they doing that? Well, that's the feedback that they seem to be getting from journals, perhaps, or the feedback they think they're getting. Yeah. And then it becomes self-determining. Their advisors tell them that's the way to do it, and then they tell presumably their students how to do it. And some of these people, they're so bright and successful, they'll get on editorial boards, and then we'll just keep reinforcing the same thing, which is very disturbing. And then on the other hand, some studies should do causality, so we want to support them too. And how do we do it well? So they were sort of the twin motivations.
So you came up, and you have these three types. People need to, and we're going to link to the paper, and certainly, and I think that, I could actually map your three types somewhat to Aristotle's the four forms of causation, but path analytic, configurational, those kind of I like the terms, and I know these aren't the terms you had the first time you presented it, right? You changed them around. Where on earth did you come up with potential outcomes for like experiment and like the experimental and the econometrics paradigm? That's what that middle view of causation is. And I would say that's classic experiment and econometrics, which is an attempt to approximate classic experiments, right? Using empirical data. Why potential outcomes?
If I can jump in here, I think so. Potential outcomes is a fairly well-established term. It is coined by, I think, Rubin. Rubin uses this term, potential outcomes, and it comes from statistics. And Neyman, I think he was the one who created the notation for denoting potential outcomes back in 1920s when he was thinking about the agricultural experiments. And then Donald Rubin did some seminal work in 1974 paper, and he extended that work to the context of observational data. So this is a fairly well-used term in statistics literature, and economists also tend to use this term quite frequently now. In fact, that has been the convergence in the last 20 to 30 years. Potential outcomes view in statistics has been combined with the traditional econometric view of doing our statistical work in the field of economics. So these two things have kind of converged over time.
Right. And the first time you presented it, you kind of used Pearl's language of counterfactual and correlational, and right. And then you switched to Rubin. What, it was less offensive to people, or what happened?
I think they are used almost interchangeably. Like, potential. Some people prefer potential outcomes. There are other, but potential outcomes uses the language of counterfactual. So it is not that counterfactual is something that belongs to, let's say, Julia Pearl or somebody like that. No, these are very well established terms. Used by both statisticians and also econometricians.
Well, it's also been used, this counterfactual approach. This is probably my favorite of the three, but it's also a fairly well-used methodology in historical sciences and in political sciences, sort of asking question, what happened to, this in the state of a particular region if this and this other thing would have happened, and so forth, right? I've just never seen it in a statistical sense. I've always been as a thought experiment, as a narrative, or if you want, as a qualitative type of inquiry. And it got me thinking. I don't know this, but now we have it in editorial. Do we have many examples of this prior to this editorial of counterfactual reasoning in information systems?
Yes, I think I wrote a paper in ISR in 2009. And in fact, the title of the article was From Association to Causation via a Potential Outcomes Approach. Yeah, so there are quite a few people. I think, Nina, I think, does work quite a lot in this area. Ling has used papers, has published papers using this methodology. So in the IS research, I think this in the last, I would say, certainly in 15 years, 10, 15 years, this has really become a very, very dominant methodology to use when data permits that.
So you said 15 years, right? And you all three have experience with this. But let's talk about these early years, right? So when you said, look, this counterfactual thinking, this when you started doing this, I'm just imagining this must have been tough from a review perspective, no? I mean, that it was not the normal way of doing things. Do you remember what it was like, and how you eventually convinced reviewers that this was a robust, valid way, of doing your analysis?
Yeah, I think as with all methods, it takes a while for the new methods to get diffused and become known even among the reviewer and editorial community. So I had a tough time publishing that paper. I think it took 4 years, naturally, as it does for, I think, many of the papers which are relatively new in methodology or in concepts. But I think in general, that has been the case in other management disciplines as well. So the seminal work related to counterfactuals or potential outcomes was done in the 1980s, early 1990s, let's say. But in the management field, I think people started to pick on this literature maybe in early 2000. And I think we, in the IS field, we are lucky that, we have a very good community of IS scholars, who are very quick to understand new methods and start deploying them very, very quickly now. So we started around the same time, the way, other business disciplines started. And it has been a journey. So it was initially tough, but I think these days reviewers are asking for so many robustness checks or so many different different ways of doing things using counterfactual approach. Even if you were to go to the paper using a path analytic framework or a configurational framework, they say, why not use the potential outcomes view or something along those lines?
Yeah, thanks for having us here. So if I can share some of my perspective about counterfactual view. So I think this is in some sense, a general thought processes, although it has been, framed as a particular research methodology. But counterfactual view sort of, reflects some kind of a thought process of people in exploring what have not happened yet, but what can potentially happen. So that's why I like this term, potential outcome versus the counterfactual, because potential outcome actually includes what you have already observed and what you have not observed. So it is a thought process that we have to explore by combining the evidence we have on hand versus some of the thought about what has not happened yet. So although this is a research methodology, I think it can be linked to some kind of a general ideas in doing research, that is exploring the world that we have not experienced yet. So if we look at, for example, the relationship or exploring the correlation, right? So when people observe the correlation, they start to think about, okay, what drives these correlations? And this is something that we cannot observe. So we have to probably rely on theories or some kind of a logical thinking to, provide explanation about this unobserved status or the world. So this to me is some kind of a thought process which is similar to counterfactual, right? You are dealing with the words that you are not observing. So in terms of, methodological applications of these ways, it's more about, using some kind of, advanced evidence in, furthering proof what you have been arguing about, right? So in this case, maybe from a methodological perspective, counterfactual approach is an extension of what people have already have in mind in doing research. And so I think that's why, it attracts attention recently, and maybe it will also, continue.
I'm a little confused about this recent thing, and Recker, you're acting like this potential outcomes is new. Isn't this just the way we think about causality in experiments, which is like the oldest way of doing science? I mean, what's all this talk about it being new and interesting and different? I would think this is like the 101 of causality. It's like, Nina, I don't know. Am I missing something here?
Adding to Nick's point, yes, I mean, the counterfactual or potential outcome view is the, let's say, the philosophical foundation of experimental thinking. And I would say right now we are trying to distinguish causal identification from causal explanation. Moving beyond, at least in my view, moving beyond what we can do with experiments and with econometrics. What kind of explanation can we offer? Adding to what we have observed. That's what I think would be very interesting in science.
So the new part is really the identification, the pressures that we have there, right?
And the explanation.
Yeah.
If I can just add to that. So the new part is, so although we knew, like even experiments, like in the big scheme of things, in terms of our understanding, in terms of human evolution, even experiments, I would argue, are only 100 years old. I mean, before 100 years ago or 200 years ago, we never did any experiments, right? So even experimental technology is only less than 100 years old, right? Think about Fisher's work.
Do we agree to this?
1920s, 1930s, right? Now, what is new here is, how do we use that language of experimentation when you actually did not conduct an experiment? So how to think about that experimental setting, even in observational data, when we have passively collected data, can we still invoke the same language of experimentation? Can we denote it properly in terms of potential outcomes? And can we think about what is driving the outcomes? And then how do we interpret? So I think there was traditional econometrics. So for example, there is an instrumental variable estimation. And how to interpret that instrumental variable estimation and what it is giving us, that knowledge is new. I mean, that we did not know. So before 1990s, the work of the Nobel laureates who got the Nobel Prize last year, they clarified to us what are we finding when we are estimating something through instrumental variable estimation. So all that knowledge is very, very new. And all these developments have taken place only in the last 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, that's also what I meant a little bit. Look, as I mentioned, I read up a little bit. I was reading actually a lot about Judith Pearl's work in this area. And what struck me was this idea of using observations and experiments to then offer explanation about the neither observed nor experimented, right? The counterfactuals. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. And no, I hadn't seen that necessarily before. And he also argued this is pretty new, right? This way of causal explanation and the way we can model these and formalize these. We haven't had that for a long time. So that's what I said. Like, it feels like this is a recent way of doing or thinking about this.
Yeah, thanks, Yang. So I think another way to interpret your point is that, the new way of thinking is to help us make clear about, various assumptions that used in these different ways, right? So for example, doing experiments. So nowadays, we are realizing more and more about the assumptions that doing experiments should also be based on. So, and also without these assumptions that even if you can do experiments, you may not have the reliable evidence to support your research arguments. So in this case, I think that the new understanding is all about these kind of assumptions, what you can do and what you cannot do.
Can I add one thing? I just, when we had these discussions, you said before about the backstory and things, and I guess there's a story when you work on editorials or when you work on papers. And one thing that Sunil had brought to this, which I just think was fantastic, was, what's the IS angle? Like, how should IS scholars think about causality? And Sunil mentioned a paper in sociology that did that for sociology, and I think that was just really important, because in terms of these questions of like what's new and what's old, I think it's basically any topic is both new and old. Like it's an ongoing conversation by scholars, and so we could study it through a sociology of science, right? Like a particular area becomes interesting and many people work on it and it has a history to it, and all of the views we talk about in this editorial have that. They have a history, they have a current, and so on. But what we wouldn't want in our field is just to race on other people's paths and say, oh, look at all these people in sociology doing this, that's what we should do. Or look at all these people in computer science doing this, that's what, we have to think, what do we want to do? What's important in our field? And I think that was something that Sunil brought early on to this conversation that was just really important. And I think we really hope the editorial sparks a dialogue. We don't have all the answers here, but we want to spark a dialogue, and maybe these smart people in the doctoral consortium will have new views and take us further about what's important in IS. I think that would be fantastic.
I like this very much. I mean, when like I don't have that sociology. I usually have this, I don't know what you want to call this, a practice view, sort of what is it that people do in our field? What are the papers that we get submitted? What is it that the doctoral consortium students talk about when they present their work? And what is that we present at the conference and so forth? And when you look at this, it doesn't matter that certain ways of doing science have been around for 40 years. If we get to see, like I remember a time where every paper was partially square paper, literally every paper. Yeah. And there was a time where, I don't know, we had other types of dominant ways, usually singular ways of doing things. And usually they were sort of the outcome of certain editorials providing a legitimization and a script for doing things a certain way. Right. So when I was a doctoral student, this was the high time of correlational modeling. Right. So we had PLS, we had Lisrel, we had a war between these two things. There were editorials published that sort of sorted this out and gave a few examples, and one of the classic examples of that time was, look, if you have a small sample, use PLS. Now we know this is not a good argument at all, but we've seen then papers for 20 years using this argument based on that script and so forth. Sorry, so follow along, Ilya. What I'm getting at, I suppose, is now this backstory, Andrew, that you said, look, we want to be open and we want to have multiple ways of doing science in our field. That's wonderful. And then we write editorials that say, look, these ways are legitimate. Now, what we also do is we now script them. Right now, we give them a reason like, I'm doing this and that should be okay too. And over time, usually they get to scriptedness as well, in the good sense that readers and reviewers become more familiar, and in the bad sense that they become these narrow tunnels for how to do certain things. And we've seen this over and over again as we introduce new approaches into our field, whether that be quantitative strategies, design orientation. We see the same thing with computational methods now. There's always this tension between scriptedness and legitimization, I suppose, especially with crafting these editorials. Do you worry about that? A similar thing will happen here, that people take this in a template and say, like, I'm doing configurational, get this published. I'm doing everything that you guys asked me to, publish my paper.
I do worry about that. We did include a section, especially towards the end of the paper, where we talked about the role of reviewers and editors and the role of negotiations between authors and editors to try to address that. Of course, there's a question of whether people read the editorial, but the fact that we're even on this podcast gives me great confidence that people will think about these things and hopefully they'll read that section. But there's only so much we can do. It takes bright authors, it takes good editors, and hopefully as a field we'll move forward.
Well, and I disagree actually with Recker here. I think he reads this and he's like, oh, there's a script. I think you did a really nice job not having a script, right? I think you tried to abstract it up a bit, right? This isn't an experimental or an econometrics when you talk about your potential outcomes, right? When you talk about path, you weren't saying structural equation modeling. Right. You were saying, all right, there's this, and then configurational, you didn't say QCA. So those are specific, although you alluded to each of these, but you aggregated them in a bigger group of approaches, which makes me think with my agenda of identifying computationally intensive patterns, right? I feel like we can identify patterns, particularly in either the path or the configurational branches, without necessarily fitting into maybe an old traditional structural equation modeling box or a QCA box. I don't know, Sunil, was that something you intended here to make it broader?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you here completely, Nick. And I think we had a deliberate stance, like we did not want to say that this is the only legitimate way of doing things, or people should even combine these different approaches. So we deliberately left many things unsaid. And we actually provided, extensive references. We said if somebody is interested in pursuing a particular approach, here are the references, or maybe you can read this literature on that. And one other thing we tried to do in this editorial was, so as editors, we have seen sometimes, let's say, you have a paper and there are 3 reviewers, but they are approaching the causality issues in the paper from very different perspectives. So even the kinds of questions that they are asking to the authors sometimes may not make any sense. So this editorial was trying to basically say, hey, maybe you should not be asking too much about things related to generalizability when somebody is doing, let's say, a configurational approach, because those questions may not make sense, because this method is really not designed to do that. But even otherwise, like when we think about generalizability, you cannot establish generalizability from any single study, regardless of which paradigm you belong to. So the other objective here was to basically sensitize the members of the review panels, because most of the time we see that PhD students, they would have taken, let's say, 2 courses or 4 course sequence of some statistical approaches, but they are not necessarily familiar with other approaches. So we really also wanted to do some level playing field for the editors and for the reviewers, so that the questions that are posed to the authors are relevant to the inquiry in the information systems literature.
But you said 2 things just now. One is you can't establish generalizability from any case or from any particular study. And let me just, this is something I want to underscore, that by itself, no study is or has ever been generalizable. Period, full stop, by something inherent to the study, right? It's always a case. Even if I grabbed all of the data of a population at a point in time, or over the course of 10 years, or over the course of 50 years, all I'm doing is a case study of those 50 years, and I can say nothing about the previous or the post 50 years, right? So there's nothing inherent about any study that is generalizable. What we do, however, is we make generalizations. Generalizations are always things humans do, extrapolating from what we see, right? So I think what you said is really important, that I think people get wrapped around the axle thinking that there's something called generalizability and that some research is generalizable and some research isn't. I love that you said none of it is, because none of it is. We're all just doing case studies. Some of us are using case studies with a bunch of data. Some of us are using case studies talking to a single person. Carl Weick reads a book and writes about it, right? So I love that, Sunil. I think that's something we need to underscore more.
And actually, one other thing we say very explicitly somewhere in the paper is that no single study also ever proves causality to everybody's satisfaction.
Yeah.
Right? So every single study can only provide, I think Goldthorpe, I think Andrew was talking about this study from sociology, that every study provides evidence that is, it provides a corroboration pending account. So it provides just one tentative evidence, but it further needs corroboration, more studies to figure out the mechanisms and things of that nature.
Yep, I agree.
Now, I want to pick this, I want to go a little bit sideways here, because you haven't just published this editorial, right? You also did a whole series of masterclasses. I've attended one of them, but I know you've done several of them, because that's something I wanted to pick up about, because this is what I love about this is that, normally we publish a paper, and then as Andrew said, well, you still have to hope that people read it, interpret it correctly, and apply it faithfully, right? But usually that doesn't go far enough in educating the reviewers and the readers, right? So this idea of offering basically free workshop sessions and so forth to educate people about some of these views and so forth. You've done this now, like, do you feel this is taking effect? Is it creating some impact? I know you've had huge numbers attending these classes. Do you think that's a strategy we should basically pursue now, with not just with editorial, with any papers, really? I mean, a paper should be accompanied with a bit of a broadcasting sort of session, I'm thinking. What have been your experiences with your masterclasses is what I'm asking.
Maybe I can address that one. I think there's 2 parts to it. So one is an internal part and an external. So internal is the editorial board discussing it. Yeah. So you could think of an editorial board as purely individual work, purely reactive, like individual editors sitting at their desk, they get a paper, they do it, and they send it back. And they may turn up once a year to an editorial board meeting. That's the only collective part of it, kind of thing. So I guess, we've worked hard, and many journals do, to try to think of a collective. Like, how can we learn from each other? How can we share knowledge, become better as a collective? How can we collectively help the field, and so on? So that's one part of this. There's so much learning we can get. You mentioned, Nick, I think experiments. And I remember in an early meeting saying, it was in the masterclass, saying something about experiments. Oh, well, experiments do this potential already. And Nina kind of corrected me, because, even though I was a lab experimentalist, to be honest, when I didn't think about it through the potential outcome lens, and I've learned more through, these discussions. So there's an internal part of it. Then there's the external, like talking with the community, the authors, the reviewers, Now, whether we should do that for all papers and all topics and things, it's a scalability problem. I'd love to do it. You guys did a fantastic job with the Managing AI special issue. Can all journals do it for all papers and all editorials? It depends how much we want to sleep. There's sort of a scalability question, but it's a really interesting question for journals and for editors and for authors.
I just think it's an author. It could be an author responsibility. I know certain people, not in our field, in other fields, that actually go around and they workshop their papers after they've been published, right? And some disciplines, like for example, some computer science conferences, they basically have at least slots or sessions where you present published work rather than unpublished work. And I wonder sometimes whether we should do this more. If there's a really, really good idea that we could work more on the adoption, diffusion of good ideas, of good guidelines and so forth. At the moment it's left to, I have an idea for a new way of doing science. And if I'm happy to do it, I can organize a bunch of workshops, but if I'm not, then I won't. Yeah. So I do think that it's something not as a scalability issue for journals. I'm not asking Andrew to do more, but really as authors, I think sometimes we should pick up a little bit more and work more on the cultivation and distribution of our ideas, not just writing papers.
So if you look at your editorial, and I'd like to ask each of you this, which I think should be, I hope it's as impactful to the community as it is for me. I love it, and I'll be citing it, and I'll be using it in my review processes. But for each of you, I'd like to ask each of the authors, if you had a number one takeaway that you would want readers, IS researchers to take away from the editorial, which I think is an important stake in the ground. What do you think that takeaway should be? I don't know. Can we maybe start with Ling and then Nina? And then back up to Sunil and Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I think that's a great question. So I think when you ask this question, the number one word pop up in my mind is complementarity. I think, different methodology. So going back to some of our earlier questions. So I think one of our objective was not to, make this editorial like a research methodology driven piece. So we are talking about perspective. So in the sense that we want to, highlight the potential complementarity between different ways of thinking. So research methodology can be exclusive in some sense, but the way of thinking, can definitely accommodate different, ideas. So in this regard, I think, complementarity is a good idea, or at least a good way for people to, think about, for example, the generalizability issue you have talked about, right, Nick? So although each individual studies cannot be generalized, but different study can definitely complement each other's to contribute to the overall theoretical thinking of our field. That's also related back to the Andrew's discussion about what is IS, right? I think it's related to some of our old conversation about what is IS identity. I think IS is not characterized by some research methodology, but by its way of thinking about the phenomena, technological-driven phenomena, and what theoretical perspective we can build. And if we can do that, I think, that can benefit all the fields. So the complementarity is something that actually I think should be the most takeaway.
And even your table 4, right, gets at that. You're saying, okay, these are what the different approaches kind of emphasize, what their strengths are and their weaknesses are. Yeah.
I love this very much, Ling. I mean, like it picks up on something that Nick and I have discussed at length over various episodes of the podcast, which is this idea that most of our papers should be research notes. Now, if you think about it, if you had a paper using one of the ways to causality, and they saying, look, why can't we just publish a whole bunch of complementary extensions, maybe, the same study from a configurational view, maybe here, these sorts of things. And then we could have a whole series, a whole program of work that could be published, and together tells us a much better picture than any of the individual studies could ever do. And I think the research note would be a wonderful format for achieving exactly this without having to write these grand 60-page essays all the time.
Yep. Nina, what do you think?
Yes, I would say a main takeaway, at least for me, as part of the team, is we do have a trade-off between the importance of your research questions and the rigor of your methods. Yeah, wow. And we are seeing, as Andrew mentioned,
that's a bold statement.
Really?
I think so. I love it. But you just said there's a trade-off between the importance of the question and the rigor of the method. So you're basically saying the more rigorous you are, the more worthless what it is that you're saying. And if you really want to say something
I look at it differently. I don't see it that way at all, Nick.
For clarification, what I'm trying to say is we do not want papers that just pursue causality for the sake of pursuing that causality. Yeah, we want papers that answer interesting and important research questions and have impact to industry practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now you're less bold. I like the previous Nina. Rewind the audio recording, Jan. We're going to stop at the previous Nina.
I'm going to back up Nina here, because the way that I interpreted what you said, Nina, is the more impactful and important your question is, I think the more leeway you may have in how you pursue this, right? And then maybe we want to look at something and give you a little bit of leeway in how exactly you establish causality, say, about a very, very important question, rather than rewarding the papers that have a particular strict view of causality on a particularly unimportant question, because we see quite a few of these. Yeah.
Well, all right. So I interrupted you, Nina. I'm sorry. Continue, please.
Oh, I'm done.
You can't be done. That's record mansplaining. This is awful.
I was just backing up. No, what?
Thank you so much, Yan.
All right. I feel bad now. I interrupted you, and you let Recker finish your thought. This is awful. All right. So you know what I need you to do, Nina, before we hang up, or at some point in my life, you have to explain Granger causality to me. I don't know if we'll have time for that today, but it seems like that's that thing where everybody can be happy with it, right? This, it doesn't fit into a bucket. And then all of a sudden we can, if we say Granger causality, then now all of a sudden we don't have to be econometricians. We don't have to have a structural equation model. We can just say Granger causality, right? Which is more of a correlational causality. I don't know anything about it. Can someone explain this to me? And then we'll get on to Sunil and Andrew's takeaways. Did I just derail? Did I put a wet blanket on the discussion? No one wants to describe Granger to me.
So when it comes to Granger causality, so I remember Goldsboro Rose has 2001 papers, in sociology fields talking about the Granger causality from a predictive perspective. So the simple point here is that Granger causality provides a way to explain the correlation between the independent variable you have and outcome variable you have, after controlling for a series of other factors, right? So if you can still have more predictive power of your outcome variables using your independent variables, so you can make these kind of related arguments about Granger causality. So Granger causality, to some extent, that provides us, an explanation based on the correlation. So you don't have to dive into these kind of, econometrics, sophisticated methodology, but you can still make these arguments. So, but it is predictive in nature. So that's why it may have some backfires, when actually people take these counterfactual perspective or potential outcome perspective. Right. But I think it's a great contribution in forming these causal arguments based on the correlation evidence you have on hand.
So what we're saying is we can hide behind Granger causality when we say, look, I have a logical reason for taking this correlation and arguing outside of the statistics that there's something causal at play, but you're not going to find that causal logic in the empirical data. You're going to find it in my explanation, right?
So in some sense, I think it illustrates, that the evidence you have may not be direct causal, but you can still rely on theoretical arguments to, dive into the causal explanations, for your correlation data.
Yeah.
Also, I don't think it's true that you can hide behind anyone. The more we read papers on causality, the more we realize a lot of people don't like each other at all. And there are different camps and they have very different views. And you'll read one and you think, this is, the answer. And then another one hates them. And, I think there was even a recent paper on Granger causality talking about all the recent problems and opportunities and things. Nothing is fixed. No one agrees with everything,
Don't Rubin and Pearl have a feud or something?
Pearl has a feud with everyone, I think.
Many people have feuds, yeah.
All right, so we didn't get to Sunil. Sunil, what's the big takeaway you would like people to...
So I think, let me just address one thing that Nina was saying about, and just clarify that. So we are not necessarily saying here at all that the pursuit of causality always leads to trivial problems, not at all. In fact, the Nobel laureates of last year, their work demonstrates that they worked on very fundamental problems, the effect of minimum wages on unemployment. It sounds like a very simple question, but highly policy relevant. And they were able to leverage natural experiments and other kinds of, let's say, methodologies to give us much better answer than the answer we had 30 years ago, for example. So my guess is, just because one is pursuing causality does not necessarily rule out that they're not working on important problems. What we are concerned with was, when we were writing the editorial, was that people, let's say, choosing research problems where they could, let's say, satisfy all the robustness checks. I think that was the concern that Andrew raised. And that's a very legitimate concern, because I also have PhD students and who say, well, people will ask me this question or this robustness test, or will I be able to satisfy those kinds of things? And I think the point we want to make through this editorial is start with working on important research problems, and then have a programmatic research agenda. So maybe you might want to think about causality using potential outcomes in one project, but then nothing prevents you from also thinking about maybe conjunctural causation using a configurational viewpoint, also retaining flexibility to be open to path analytic viewpoint that will give you causal explanation, like what are the mediating mechanisms, under what situations the effects are stronger or weaker, like moderating mechanism, things of that nature. So if you have a more flexible toolkit, you will be able to come up with formulating better research questions. And I think that will really improve the science of information systems, like the things that worry our stakeholders, CIOs or managers, how to deploy IT systems, how much money to invest in information technology, for example. So those are really important problems and issues we should be thinking about, rather than worrying too much about whether I'll be able to satisfy this particular test as part of this particular method.
Agree fully. Can I extend that even, Sunil, a little bit? I fully agree with everything you said. And I would add a third part as sort of stewards of the field. Do what you said and have it published in our journals. Now, I'm thinking of the recent work by Eric and Sina Naral, the study on LinkedIn. Why isn't that published in our journals? I was just last week, I was seeing this very big experimental study on what Instagram and what it does in exposing vulnerable minority groups, underage girls. Why isn't that published in our journals? I want that we be able to do this and that we will publish these. Yeah,
I think so. I have, slight different viewpoint on that. In fact, I actually applaud people who are willing to go outside our discipline and publish their work in Nature, Science, and other kinds of outlets. So I think my guess is we should not have this idea that if IS scholars are doing very important work, it should not get legitimacy, or it should be published only in MIS Quarterly and ISR to make its true impact felt. In fact, that is simply not true. In fact, I feel happy when they are able to take their work to American Economic Review or other kinds of outlets, because different outlets have, so all said and done, MIS Quarterly is a great journal. ISR is a great journal. I would love to publish my papers there, also in management science. But I think I would also love to publish my papers in Nature and Science. They give you far greater platform, far greater visibility. So I think, and senior scholars have a particular responsibility to actually try out and make our messages much more clear and visible in these other outlets if they have an opportunity to do so.
Very well said. Stand corrected. Very well said. Yeah.
All right. So Andrew.
Yeah, look, I think I mentioned it earlier that the more we worked on it, the more we saw in the topic. So it became harder to say what the takeaway was. There was all these different things. And we worked hard on the title of the editorial, and it became a bit, I don't know if anyone's ever written a survey question, the more you look at it, the more ambiguities you see, and it's so hard to write something clear. And so it was causality meets diversity in IS research, and you could look at the causality meets diversity, like diverse views of causality, or you can think of the diversity in information systems research and how we should think about causality for the diverse views of it. And we're trying to do both. So if I guess readers can think about both aspects, we'd be really happy. My concern is that they might look at all the diverse views of causality, and the takeaway they might see is, oh, MISQ is still Causality Quarterly. It's just that there's these three different views. But, there's diverse views of IS research, some of which might not need as much focus on causality. And we do say that here, but it could potentially get lost. So I guess I just want to underscore that.
So MISQ is not Causality Quarterly, Wrecker.
Yeah.
So and I'll tell you what I love about this is that it'll give authors and editors a language. If I'm editing a paper and I see one of the reviewers come back with a certain view of, say, instrumental variable and robustness checks that I think is grabbing the potential outcomes view, where the authors, for example, are trying to take more of a path view, I could use this article now and say, look, they're heavy theory. They're taking a path view, and as an author, you could say that too. Say, listen, reviewer, you're subjecting me to this criteria. I'm actually writing an article in this other paradigm. Work with me here. So I love that, and I would love to see more of that. And I think this gives us a language of that we can have that discussion in the review process.
So everyone, it was really wonderful to have you on. Really fantastic. Also, I challenged some of my views and got corrected very, very appropriately. So I think it's a tremendous editorial. I think it'll generate a lot of impact if this can help a little bit spread the message. I think people listen more than they read.
Oh no. Or maybe the listening will help them go to read.
Everyone go and read this paper. It's a really important editorial. And it'll make us all better. Absolutely. And also thanks everyone for coming on. I know this was difficult to organize with all the different time zones, and Andrew got the worst of it. We should point that out as usual. So thank you, Andrew. Thanks everyone else as well.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick and Yang. Yeah, really
appreciate
it.
You're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.